There is a moment that comes to almost everyone, usually late at night, when the noise of the day finally stops, and the truth you've been avoiding walks quietly into the room. It sounds like this. Why does it feel like everything is falling apart? No matter how hard I try to hold it together. You chase the promotion and something else breaks. You fix the relationship and your health slips. You finally get the money and you lose your peace. It feels random. It feels cruel. It feels like life is against you. It isn't. And in the next 30 minutes, you're going to find out why. 2,000 years ago, a small group of thinkers discovered 7 truths. So simple that children could understand them, yet so demanding that most people spend their entire lives running from them. Master these 7 truths and something strange happens. The chaos doesn't disappear, but it stops controlling you. Everything, quietly, without effort, begins to fall into place. Stay until the end, because the 7th truth is the one almost nobody masters, and it's the one that changes everything else. Welcome back to Wisdom of the Stoics, the home for anyone who is tired of surviving their life and ready to start commanding it. Every week we take the ancient philosophy of Stoicism, the discipline that guided emperors, slaves and soldiers alike, and we translate it into something you can actually use tomorrow morning. No fluff, no empty motivation, just truth tested by time. If that sounds like what you need right now, hit subscribe and turn on notifications, because what you're about to hear may be the most important 25 minutes you spend this year. Let's begin. Let's start with an uncomfortable question. Have you ever noticed that the people who seem to have the least reason to be at peace are sometimes the calmest people you know? And the people who seem to have every advantage, money, looks, opportunity, are often the most anxious, the most restless, the most quietly miserable. This isn't an accident. It isn't luck. It's a skill gap. Some people have learned how reality actually works, and most people are still operating on a broken map. Around the year 50 AD, a crippled slave named Epictetus was beaten so badly by his master that his leg was permanently damaged. He owned nothing. He controlled nothing about his external circumstances. And yet, centuries later, his teachings would be read by Roman emperors, by soldiers on the eve of battle, by prisoners in concentration camps, by CEOs, by parents burying children, by anyone who needed to find solid ground when the floor of life gave way. How does a man with nothing become a source of strength for people who had everything? Because Epictetus understood something most of us never learn. The world does not owe you order. It was never going to arrange itself around your comfort. The chaos you feel isn't a malfunction. It's the baseline. What changes everything is not the chaos disappearing. It's you learning to stand inside it without being swept away. That's what these 7 truths are. Not tricks to make your problems vanish. Tools to make you the kind of person your problems can no longer break. Let's get into truth number 1. And I promise you, if you've never heard this explained clearly before, it's going to reframe every frustration you've ever had. Truth number 1. You suffer because you're fighting the wrong battle. Picture this. A man wakes up late for an important meeting. Traffic is backed up for miles. He grips the wheel, checks the clock every 10 seconds, and by the time he arrives, 20 minutes late, he's soaked in sweat, furious, and his whole day is ruined before it's even started. Now picture a different man in the exact same traffic jam. Same delay, same meeting at stake. But this man leans back, puts on a podcast, and thinks, there's nothing I can do about this road right now. I'll call ahead, let them know, and use this time to think. He arrives at the same meeting, 20 minutes late, but calm, clear-headed and unshaken. Same traffic, same delay, same consequences. 2 completely different experiences of reality. This is the first truth, and it is the foundation every other truth is built on. The source of nearly all your suffering is not what happens to you. It's your judgment about what happens to you. Epictetus opened his entire philosophy with this one idea, and he made it almost mathematically simple. He said there are only 2 categories of things in your life. Things that are up to us, our judgments, Our choices, our effort, our reactions, and things that are not up to us, other people's opinions, the weather, the economy, other people's choices, the past, and most of the future. Here's the part that stings. Almost every ounce of anxiety you carry comes from investing emotional energy into the second category. You lie awake replaying what someone said about you, something you cannot control. You panic about an outcome that depends on 10 variables you don't own. You resent a decision someone made years ago that you cannot undo. Think about your own life for a second. How much of your stress this past week came from things genuinely inside your control versus things you were simply trying to force, wish, or worry into a different shape? If you're honest, the number is staggering. Most people spend 80–90% of their emotional energy fighting battles they were never equipped to win, while neglecting the one battlefield where they actually hold complete authority, their own mind. Marcus Aurelius, the most powerful man in the known world, Emperor of Rome, wrote to himself at night, not for an audience, not for fame, just to remember this truth before he slept. He'd lost children. He faced plagues, wars, betrayal from people he trusted. And in his private journal, the one we now call Meditations, he kept returning to a version of the same reminder. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this and you will find strength. Not you have power over outcomes. Not you have power over what people think of you. Power over your mind. That's the entire territory you actually own. Here's a practical way to apply this today. The next time something upsets you, a comment, a delay, a disappointment, pause for 3 seconds and ask one question. Is this inside my control or outside it? If it's outside your control, your only job is to adjust your response and let the rest go. If it's inside your control, your only job is to act. Not to worry, not to spiral, just to act. This single habit, practiced daily, is what separates people who are dragged through life by circumstance from people who move through life with quiet command. Let me ask you something in the comments below, and I genuinely want to know, what's one thing you've been fighting for control over this week that, if you're honest, was never yours to control in the first place? Write it down. Sometimes just naming it breaks its grip on you. Now, understanding what's in your control is powerful, but it raises an obvious question. If so much of life is genuinely outside your control, how do you stop resenting that fact? How do you stop wishing reality were different? That brings us to the second truth, and it's one of the most misunderstood ideas in all of Stoicism. Truth number 2, stop wishing for a different reality. There's a story about a woman, we'll call her Elena, who spent 3 years of her life wishing her divorce had never happened. Every morning, she woke up replaying what she could have said differently, what she could have done to save the marriage, mourning the life she was supposed to have. 3 years spent fighting a war against something that had already happened. Then one day, exhausted, she stopped. Not because she found peace, because she ran out of energy to keep fighting a battle against the past. And in that exhaustion, something shifted. She stopped asking, why did this happen to me? And started asking, what can I build now that this has happened? Within a year, she'd started a business the version of her still married never would have had the courage to start. The event didn't change. Her relationship to the event did. And that relationship was the entire difference between 3 wasted years and a new life. This is the Stoic concept the Romans called amor fati, the love of fate. Not the acceptance of fate, not the tolerance of fate, the love of it. This is one of the most radical ideas in the history of human thought, and most people who've heard the phrase don't actually understand what it demands. It does not mean pretending bad things are good. It does not mean smiling through abuse or injustice or loss. It means something more precise and more powerful, refusing to waste your finite life force, wishing the past had been different. Because the past cannot be edited, and every ounce of energy spent wishing it were different is energy, stolen from building what comes next. Marcus Aurelius wrote something that sounds almost impossible at first, that the obstacle in the path becomes the way. Not the obstacle blocks the way, the obstacle becomes the way. Whatever stands in front of you, the illness, the betrayal, the failure, isn't separate from your path. It is your path now. The moment you accept that, you stop wasting energy wishing you were on a different path, and you start using all of your energy to walk the one you're actually on. Think about people you admire, not the people who seem to have had an easy life, the people who seem to have real depth, real strength, real wisdom. Almost without exception, they were forged by something difficult, not because suffering is good, but because they stopped fighting the fact that it happened and started asking what it made possible. Here's an example many of you will recognize. Nick Vujicic was born with no arms and no legs. By any measure, his fate was cruel beyond imagination. He has spoken openly about the years he spent in despair, even attempting to take his own life as a child. But at some point, something shifted in him, not the removal of his circumstances. They never changed. He still has no arms and no legs today, but a refusal to keep resenting the body he was given. Today he has traveled the world, inspired millions, built a family, built a life so full it would be enviable even to people with every physical advantage. The fate didn't change. His relationship with the fate did, and that changed everything else. This is not about spiritual bypassing. It is not about ignoring pain or rushing to find the silver lining before you've allowed yourself to grieve. Stoicism is not about suppressing emotion. Even Marcus Aurelius wept for his children. It's about the moment after the grief. When you have a choice, continue fighting a war against a fact that cannot be changed, or turn your face toward what's actually in front of you and begin building there. If you're in a season right now where you keep replaying, "Why did this happen to me?" I want you to try something this week. Instead of asking why, ask, given that this has happened, what is now possible that wasn't possible before? You don't have to like the answer. You just have to ask the question, because the question itself starts moving your energy from the past into the present. And if this idea is landing for you, if there's a "why did this happen to me" story you've been carrying, drop it in the comments. Not for sympathy, for release. Sometimes speaking it out loud is the first step to putting it down. Now here's where it gets interesting, because if you truly accept truth number 2, you might expect the outcome to be resignation, a kind of passive shrug at life. But the Stoics discovered the opposite. Accepting what has already happened doesn't make you passive about the future. In fact, it's the exact thing that lets you prepare for the future without fear. That's truth number 3. Truth number 3. The people who suffer least are the ones who imagined suffering first. Here's something that will sound backwards at first, and then, by the end of this section, will make complete sense. The Stoics practice something called premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of adversity. Every morning before anything had gone wrong, they would deliberately imagine what could go wrong, not to manifest disaster, not out of pessimism, but to rehearse the emotional response in advance so that if disaster actually came, it wouldn't ambush them. Seneca, one of the wealthiest men in Rome, a former advisor to an emperor, practiced this obsessively. Each night he imagined losing his fortune. He imagined exile. He imagined death, his own, and the deaths of people he loved. Not because he was gloomy, because he understood something crucial. The surprise is often what breaks people, not the event itself. Think about the last time something truly bad happened to you out of nowhere. Wasn't part of the devastation the shock of it? The feeling of, "I never saw this coming"? Now think about a hard situation you actually saw coming, a diagnosis you were warned about, a layoff you sensed building for months. Painful, yes, but manageable in a completely different way, because some part of you had already begun preparing. This is the mechanism behind premeditatio malorum. When you spend even 5 minutes imagining a setback before it happens, losing a job, a friend moving away, a plan falling through, your mind starts building the muscle to handle it. And here's the counterintuitive part. This doesn't make you anxious about the future. Done correctly, it makes you calmer, because you've already proven to yourself, in imagination, that you can survive it. There's a modern parallel worth mentioning. Special forces operators, elite athletes, surgeons, nearly all of them use some version of this. They visualize failure before it happens. The parachute that doesn't open cleanly, the shot that misses, the complication mid-surgery. Not to expect failure, but to remove its power to paralyze them if it comes. The people who fall apart under pressure are usually the ones who never let themselves imagine the pressure existing at all. Let's make this practical, because I don't want you to walk away from this section just nodding along. Tonight, before you sleep, spend 90 seconds, that's all, imagining one realistic difficulty that could arise tomorrow. Not catastrophizing, just one plausible obstacle. Ask yourself, if this happened, what would I do? Answer it. Then let it go and sleep. Do this for a week and notice what changes. You'll find that small disruptions that used to derail your entire day barely register anymore. Not because your life got easier, because you stopped being ambushed by it. There's a companion practice worth mentioning here too. Memento mori, the remembering that you will die. It sounds morbid on the surface, but it's actually one of the most life-affirming ideas the Stoics ever produced. Marcus Aurelius kept a servant whose sole job, according to tradition, was to whisper, "You too shall die," during moments of triumph, not to depress him, but to keep him honest about what actually matters. Because here's the truth almost nobody wants to sit with. You do not know how much time you have left. Nobody does. And the moment you actually absorb that, not as a scary thought to push away, but as a clarifying one, your priorities reorganize themselves instantly. The grudge you're holding suddenly looks small. The apology you've been avoiding suddenly looks urgent. The dream you keep postponing suddenly looks non-negotiable. If you found this section uncomfortable, good. That discomfort is the exact sensation of a truth doing its job. If this is resonating with you, that's exactly the kind of shift this channel exists to create. So if you haven't already, now's a good moment to hit that subscribe button, because what's coming in the next 4 truths builds directly on this foundation. Truth number point 4. Your reactions are the only thing you will ever truly own. Let's talk about a scenario nearly everyone has lived through. Someone cuts you off in traffic. Someone insults you in a meeting. Someone you trusted lets you down. In that instant, it feels like your reaction is automatic, like anger, or hurt, or panic simply happens to you, the same way weather happens to you. The Stoics discovered something that modern psychology has since confirmed with remarkable precision. There is a gap, small but real, between the event and your reaction to it. And inside that gap lives your entire power as a human being. This is called the discipline of assent. It sounds academic, but the idea is beautifully simple. Every external event first arrives in your mind as an impression, a raw piece of information. Someone said something rude. That's the impression. What happens next? The surge of anger, the spiral of hurt. The decision to retaliate is not automatic. It is a judgment you make about that impression, so quickly that it feels instantaneous. But it is a judgment nonetheless, and judgments can be trained. Here's an example almost everyone can relate to. Imagine receiving a harsh piece of criticism from someone at work. Version 1, you read it, immediately feel your chest tighten, spend the rest of the day replaying it. Snap at your family that evening, and lie awake rehearsing comebacks you'll never say. Version 2, you read the same words, feel the same initial sting, but pause. Actually pause and ask, is there truth in this I can use? And if not, why am I giving this person's opinion so much power over my evening? Then you set it down and continue your day. Same criticism, same words, completely different outcomes. The difference is not the event, it's what you did in that tiny gap between the event and your response. Viktor Frankl, a psychiatrist who survived Nazi concentration camps and who was deeply influenced by Stoic thought, put it into words that have since become famous. between stimulus and response, there is a space, and in that space lies our power to choose our response. And in our response lies our growth and our freedom. He watched men in the camps lose everything, their families, their possessions, their freedom, and yet he observed something remarkable. Some of them, even stripped of every external thing, still walked through the camp offering comfort to others, giving away their last piece of bread. Their circumstances were identical to everyone else's. Their internal freedom was not. If a man can find that gap of freedom inside a concentration camp, you can find it in a frustrating email, an insult from a stranger online, a disappointing phone call. Here's how to actually build this skill, because insight without practice is just entertainment. The next time you feel a strong emotional reaction rising, anger, humiliation, panic, try physically pausing for a count of 3 before you speak or act. Not to suppress the emotion, to interrupt the automatic loop. In that 3-second pause, ask one question. What judgment am I adding to this event, and is it actually true? Often you'll discover the judgment is exaggerated. This ruins everything. This means I'm worthless. This person hates me, when the actual event was far smaller than the story you built around it. This is not about becoming emotionless. The Stoics were not advocating for suppression. That's a common misunderstanding. People have about this philosophy. They were advocating for authorship. You cannot always choose what happens to you. You can always choose what you decide it means and how you respond. That authorship practiced daily is the difference between a life that happens to you and a life you actually direct. I want to ask you, honestly, is there a relationship in your life right now where you've handed someone else the remote control to your emotional state, where their mood decides your mood, their approval decides your worth? Sit with that question for a second, because truth number 5 is going to address exactly that. Truth number 5. The moment you stop outsourcing your worth, you become unshakable. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from physical labor. It comes from spending your entire life monitoring how other people perceive you, checking, adjusting, performing, managing an image, flinching at criticism, craving praise, recalibrating your entire sense of self based on likes, comments, comparisons, and the passing opinions of people who, if you're honest, will forget you existed within a week. This is one of the most exhausting ways to live a human life, and it is also one of the most common. And the Stoics had a name for the antidote, the inner citadel. Picture a fortress, not a fortress made of stone, but one made entirely of your own judgment, your own values, your own sense of what is actually good and actually bad. A fortress no one can enter unless you open the gate yourself. This is the inner citadel, the part of you that remains stable no matter what praise or criticism arrives from outside. Marcus Aurelius, ruling an empire where flattery and betrayal existed in equal measure, wrote to himself constantly about this. He reminded himself that other people's opinions of him were, quite literally, none of his business, because their opinions belonged to them, shaped by their own confusion, their own moods, their own limitations, and had nothing to do with his actual character. Here's a question worth sitting with. When someone gives you a compliment, does your mood lift? When someone criticizes you, does your mood crash? If both of those are true for you, it means your emotional stability currently lives outside your own body, in the hands of whoever happens to be speaking to you at any given moment. That is not peace. That is a hostage situation, just a comfortable one. Let's use a real, relatable example. Think about a creator, a writer, an artist, someone building something publicly, who posts something they poured their heart into. 98 people love it. 2 people mock it. Which 2 comments do they remember at 2 a.m.? Nearly everyone, if they're honest, remembers the 2. This is not a character flaw. It's a wiring default. But it's a default the Stoics insisted could and should be retrained. Epictetus offered a blunt but effective mental exercise. He said to imagine that people who insult you are like small children throwing a tantrum. Their words reveal everything about their own state of mind, and nothing about your worth. When a toddler screams that you're the worst person alive because you took away a knife they were trying to play with, you don't spiral into self-doubt. You recognize the outburst for what it is: information about the child, not a verdict on you. Epictetus argued that most adult insults are exactly this, dressed up in more sophisticated language. This doesn't mean you should ignore genuine, constructive feedback from people who care about you and know you. Well, that kind of feedback is valuable, precisely because it comes from a place of investment in your growth. The inner citadel isn't about becoming impervious to all input. It's about no longer handing your entire sense of worth to strangers, critics, and passing opinions that have no real stake in your life. Here's a practice you can start today. Before you open social media, before you walk into a room full of people, silently remind yourself, my worth was decided before I walked in here, and it will remain after I leave. Nothing said in this room adds to it or subtracts from it. Only my own actions do that. It sounds almost too simple to work. Try it for 2 weeks and notice how much lighter you feel, walking through spaces that used to drain you. If you've ever caught yourself refreshing a notification, waiting for someone's reaction to validate a decision you already knew was right, comment Citadel below. I want to see how many of us are actively rebuilding this wall right now, together. We've covered 5 truths now, and each one strips away a layer of unnecessary suffering. But there's a question that naturally arises at this point. If you're not chasing outcomes, not chasing approval, not fighting reality, what exactly are you supposed to be chasing? What's actually worth pursuing? That's truth number 6. Truth number 6. Chase character, not outcomes, and watch your anxiety disappear. Here's a pattern worth noticing in your own life. Almost every time you've felt crushing anxiety, it was attached to an outcome you couldn't fully control. Will I get the job? Will they say yes? Will the test come back clean? Will people like the project? Will this relationship work out? Now here's the uncomfortable math. Outcomes are only ever partially within your control. You can prepare brilliantly for an interview and still not get the job because of factors that have nothing to do with you. Internal politics, a candidate with a personal connection, budget cuts that happen after you've already left the room. You can love someone with your whole heart, and they can still choose to leave. This is not pessimism. This is simply how a world with billions of other independent wills operates. The Stoics made a radical proposal in response to this reality. Stop making outcomes your goal. Make virtuous action your goal instead. Not because outcomes don't matter, they do, but because outcomes are a bad target for your emotional investment, since you don't fully control them. Your effort, your integrity, your preparation, your honesty in the process, that you fully control, every time, without exception. Here's a story that illustrates this well. 2 athletes train for the same competition, equally hard, equally disciplined. One walks in with a single goal: win the gold medal. The other walks in with a different goal: execute my training exactly as I practiced it, regardless of what anyone else does. Both compete. Neither wins gold. A stronger competitor edges them both out on that particular day. The first athlete is devastated, feels like a failure, questions years of sacrifice. The second athlete reviews the performance, notices they executed exactly as trained, feels a real sense of accomplishment despite the loss, and walks away already planning the next season with energy instead of despair. Same result. 2 completely different internal experiences. The difference wasn't talent, it was where they placed the target. Marcus Aurelius wrote about this using the image of an archer. A skilled archer, he said, does everything correctly: proper stance, careful aim, full focus, and then releases the arrow. Once it leaves the bow, a gust of wind can still knock it off course. Does that make the archer's technique bad? No, the archer's job was the process. The wind is not the archer's department. This reframing changes how you approach nearly everything. A difficult conversation you've been avoiding, your job isn't to guarantee the other person reacts well. Your job is to speak honestly and with care. A business you're building, Your job isn't to guarantee it succeeds. Your job is to build it with integrity, skill, and full effort. A relationship. Your job isn't to guarantee the other person never leaves. Your job is to show up as someone worth staying for. The moment you shift your target from outcome to character, something remarkable happens to your anxiety. It doesn't vanish completely. You're still human, but it loses its grip because you're no longer measuring your worth against something outside your control. You're measuring it against something you fully own. Did I act with honesty, discipline, and courage today? That question you can always answer with a yes, regardless of what the world hands back to you. This is why some of the calmest, most grounded people you'll ever meet are not the ones who've never failed. They're the ones who've stopped measuring themselves by failure and success and started measuring themselves by whether they showed up as the person they intended to be. Try this for the next 7 days. At the end of each day, instead of asking, "Did things go well?" ask, "Did I act with integrity, discipline, and effort, regardless of how things turned out?" You'll be surprised how often the answer is yes, even on days that felt, by outcome standards, like failures. Now we arrive at the 7th truth. I told you at the beginning, this is the one almost nobody masters, and it's the one that, once it clicks, makes the previous 6 truths finally click into place together. Truth number 7. You are not here forever, and that is the most freeing fact you will ever accept. Here is the truth underneath all the other truths. The one the Stoics circled back to again and again, in every letter, every private journal entry, every lecture. Your time is limited, unknown in quantity, and non-refundable. This sounds obvious when stated plainly. Everybody knows they will die someday. But knowing a fact intellectually and actually living as though it's true are two entirely different things. Almost everyone operates functionally as though they have unlimited time, postponing the apology, postponing the dream, postponing the difficult conversation, postponing the version of themselves they actually want to become, because some quiet assumption whispers, there will be time later. Seneca wrote something that still lands like a punch centuries later. He said most people don't have a short life. They make it short by wasting so much of it, not because they die young, but because they spend the years they're given on things that don't matter, chasing approval, avoiding discomfort, postponing meaning, right up until the moment it's too late to reclaim the time they burned. Here's a thought experiment worth sitting with honestly. If you knew with certainty that you had exactly 1 year left, not to scare you, just to clarify your priorities, what would you stop doing immediately? What grudge would you release within the hour because holding on to it would suddenly seem absurd? What conversation would you have that you've been avoiding for years? What dream would you finally start? Not because you'd suddenly become fearless, but because the fear of wasting your remaining time would finally outweigh the fear of failing? Now here's the harder truth. You don't actually know you don't have exactly 1 year left. None of us do. That's not meant to be morbid. It's meant to be the exact opposite, liberating. Because once you actually metabolize the fact that your time is finite and unknown, you stop treating your days like an inexhaustible resource you can spend carelessly. You start treating each one like what it actually is, the only currency you will ever truly own, and one you cannot earn back once it's spent. This is why Marcus Aurelius, arguably the most powerful man on earth at the time, chose to spend his private evenings not indulging in luxury, but reminding himself, in writing, that he too would die, that his empire would eventually crumble, that the people flattering him would one day forget his name, not to depress himself, to keep himself honest about what was actually worth his attention, while he still had it. This is the truth that ties everything else together. Truth 1 taught you to stop wasting energy on what you can't control. Truth 2 taught you to stop resenting what already happened. Truth 3 taught you to prepare for adversity without fear. Truth 4 taught you to own your reactions. Truth 5 taught you to stop outsourcing your worth. Truth 6 taught you to chase character over outcomes. And Truth 7 is the reason any of it matters at all. because your time to practice these truths is not infinite, and the version of your life shaped by mastering them is only available to you now, while you're still here to build it. So here's the question I want you to actually sit with, not just nod along to. If today were one of your last, would you be proud of how you spent your attention? And if the honest answer is no, what is one thing, just one, that you're going to change starting tomorrow morning? Let's bring this all the way home. You started this video, maybe, feeling like your life was a series of things happening to you, chaotic, unfair, exhausting. And here is the truth these 7 ideas point to. Together, the chaos was never going to disappear. That was never the promise of Stoicism, and it was never realistic. What changes is you. You stop fighting battles that were never yours to win. You stop resenting a past that cannot be edited. You start preparing for difficulty instead of being ambushed by it. You start owning the small, powerful gap between what happens and how you respond. You stop lending your emotional stability to strangers and critics. You start measuring your days by your character instead of by outcomes you never fully controlled. And you start living with the quiet urgency of someone who understands their time is limited and precious. Do all 7 of these consistently, not perfectly, just consistently, and something genuinely does shift. Not because the world becomes easier, because you become the kind of person the world can no longer knock over. That is what everything falls into place actually means. Not that circumstances arrange themselves conveniently, that you finally become steady enough to meet whatever arrives, standing upright. If even one of these 7 truths hit you differently today, if there's one you know right now, you need to start practicing this week. Write it in the comments. Not for me, for you. Writing it down is the first act of actually choosing it. And if this video gave you even a few minutes of real clarity, do 3 things before you go. Hit like, so this reaches someone else who needs to hear it today. Subscribe, so you don't miss what we build on next, because next week, we go even deeper into how the Stoics handled grief, betrayal, and starting over from nothing. And share this with one person in your life who's been fighting a battle they were never meant to win alone. Until next time, remember what's actually yours to control, let go of what isn't, and go build the life these 7 truths were pointing you toward all along. Wisdom of the Stoics. We'll see you in the next one.